So the Brazil Game Expo has recently taken place, and with it came a bunch of new interviews with Naoki Hamaguchi, who is the director of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Part 3, and he talks about balancing the identity of the game's combat and still using inspirations from previous Final Fantasies, and he talks about how they're structuring out the story for Remake Part 3, which is music to my ears. So, let's talk about it. So before we get to the Final Fantasy news, I do want to address some really sad and unfortunate news, and that's this week, as I'm recording this, legendary Japanese game developer Tomonobu Itagaki passed away. He was most known for being the head of Team Ninja with popular games like Dead or Alive and Ninja Gaiden. And I absolutely loved both of those games. Ninja Gaiden in particular, as a young kid, introduced me to these really challenging skill-based action games where you really had to learn your character, the enemies, and use your environment to your advantage. And it was kind of like the earliest forms of get good, before Souls games came out and people perceived those as like the hardest games out there. The Ninja Gaiden games were some of the most brutally difficult games I think I'd ever played, especially as a kid. And Dead or Alive is my second favorite fighting game franchise right behind Tekken. I love those characters and the music and the gameplay. I had so much fun playing those games as a kid. And Itagaki was one of the few Japanese developers at the time that truly embraced the original Xbox hardware. And it was an incredibly, incredibly powerful system. And you look at those games and how they perform, and they still look incredible to this day. Now, Itagaki was also known for the longest time as being a bit of a controversial figure within the gaming community because he had this really insane kind of persona where he was very controversial and he would talk crap about other people's games. And, looking at it now, the way that they did market some of those games, specifically Dead or Alive with the sexualization of its female characters, is certainly not great. But as a kid, that's the last thing I was thinking about. For me, it's I just uppercutted a dude, jumped up, and then hit him with an Azuna drop right on his head. I was thinking about gameplay and how much fun I was having with those games. So there's some stuff that, hasn't aged really well. But we would come to find out in recent years that the way they promoted those games and the way that he acted in interviews was really just this self-created wrestling heel persona. And he took every opportunity he could to be a little controversial to promote his own stuff. And there's this really funny interview that he did a long, long time ago. I can't remember the publication, but he was asked to list his 5 least favorite fighting games, and he would go on to list the first 5 Tekkens. He had a rivalry with Tekken, specifically with the face of Tekken, Katsuhiro Harada, and every opportunity he could, he took it and just trashed Tekken so much. It was a really funny interview in, hindsight, but we would come to learn in the past few years that that's not who he was at all. That was, again, this self-created wrestling type persona used purely just to promote his work. And he was actually incredibly reserved and very kind of self-conscious about his games, and he really genuinely loved and was passionate about the work he was doing and wanted these games to be better. And we learned that he actually really had a very close relationship with Harada. These two were actually friends. Itagaki attended Harada's wedding, and Itagaki saw Harada and Tekken as this game that could push him to be a better game developer and make his games even better. So I just think that he had a really interesting storied career creating this persona to promote his work, even though that's not actually who he truly was. He's such a legendary developer within the world of fighting games in particular, and to lose him really, really sucks. And based on some of his last words, it looks like he was working on something, but he apologized for not being able to bring that to his fans. So unfortunately, Itagaki is no longer with us, but I think that the career he had, the legacy he leaves behind with these franchises still looms very large today. And it really just, is nice to see a Ninja Gaiden coming back and seeing Team Ninja still honor his legacy. And I'm hoping, in the future, maybe they can do the same for the Dead or Alive franchise and really just kind of pay homage to him and bring that game back. So rest in peace, Itagaki-san. So in lighter news, moving over to Final Fantasy VII Remake, Naoki Hamaguchi, Square Enix is working this guy to the bone. He is everywhere. He's been attending Every single convention I can think of, any gaming expo, if you got it, he's probably there or will be going there to talk about 7 Remake on Switch and Xbox and just talking about the trilogy as a whole. Once everything is said and done, I hope he at least has some downtime to spend to himself and just kind of rest and recuperate, because he's just working himself ragged. But apparently, based on a lot of these interviews, people are saying he's in high spirits, super energetic, and I think he's just really excited to tell people about 7 Remake. So the first article we're going to be covering is coming to us from Bruno Yonezawa from Screen Rant. And the first thing he talks about is the combat of the 7 Remake trilogy and how it's inspired by previous games. Hamaguchi would go on to say, "The foundation of it all is the original Final Fantasy VII, a turn-based game. However, we do draw inspiration from many action-based games that require you to think tactically about how you battle and position yourself." He expands by saying the stagger system was pulled from Final Fantasy XIII. Also introducing Teruki Endo, he says most of Endo's career is centered around action-based games. He continues by saying, "I believe that finding the balance between the original game's turn-based system with Endo's expertise in action-based combat is what made 7 Remake's combat system so beloved by players." So this I really love. Again, if you haven't watched some of my previous videos, Teruki Endo is the combat lead for the 7 Remake trilogy, and he worked previously with Capcom on games like Resident Evil 5 and the Monster Hunter franchise, most notably Monster Hunter World. And Capcom games in particular are really, really particular about their gameplay mechanics. How does a character move? How do they block? How do they parry? How do they position and attack themselves, much like how Hamaguchi says. And there was a Square Enix interview that Hamaguchi and the team did a while back where they talked about how before Endo came on board, they had all of the menu-based stuff figured out for the combat system. That was great, felt wonderful, but the actual movement, the gameplay, the action did not feel good to play until Endo came on board and really finessed that combat system in the span of 6 months, which is pretty nuts, and the rest of the time was just spent polishing. But one of the reasons I love this combat system isn't just because it's super fun to play, but it clearly takes inspiration from previous Final Fantasy games, namely 13 with that stagger system, but there's also the original elements of OG FF7 with the ATB in the command-based menu system. You could argue that it takes inspiration from Final Fantasy XII, where you are selecting your commands and time just freezes. There's the weapon ability system that we've seen in many Final Fantasies, for me most notably I would say in Final Fantasy IX, and then there's the more action-oriented Final Fantasy of 15, which doesn't feel amazing to play by today's standards, but it was clearly trying to do something. And once you played the Royal version and you really got to jump from Noctis to Prompto to Ignis to Gladio, I think that really freshened up gameplay because all 4 of those characters played so differently from one another. And I just love this mentality of approaching their combat system of, again, you know, Japanese developers don't really like to move backwards. They like to move forwards, but that doesn't mean you can't take previous things from other games and just kind of rework them into a new combat system. So I really, really love that approach. Based on another interview we covered recently, they're going to do the same thing with whatever the game they work on next is. It's not going to be exactly like this game's combat, but they will take elements in the foundation and rework it into something brand new, which I think is incredibly exciting. Now, I will say one thing I really, really hope they do, and I don't think they're going to do this, but when everything is said and done with this remake trilogy, it'd be so cool if they put out a documentary documenting the entire process of this game being made. I so desperately want to see the CyberConnect version of this game. What worked, what didn't work. I want to see combat before Endo comes aboard. And I want to see how bad or good it was. And then I want to see how, you know, Endo's mind worked crafting this combat system. I made the joke in a previous video of, I imagine Endo's first day at Square Enix is him showing up. He's wearing all black. He's got sunglasses, a black trench coat. Everything's blacked out. And he just looks at Hamaguchi and goes, "Show me where I can cook." And then he cracks his knuckles and he just starts typing away like he's in the Matrix. I think that'd be so cool. So hopefully they put out some sort of behind the scenes featurette when this trilogy is finished. It would just be so cool to learn about the process from beginning to end. I think there's so much stuff that you could pull from and discuss. It'd be really interesting. Up next, Hamaguchi talks about some of the concerns people had in Rebirth in regards to things like time management and perhaps some sections being a little too long, or maybe padded would be the best term to use here. He says, regarding time management in certain sections, especially in Rebirth, I honestly don't believe that they were longer than necessary. I feel like nowadays players just have too much to do and too much to play, so they often feel the urge that something has to be concluded quickly. I half and half agree with him here. On the one hand, I do agree that nowadays our attention spans are cooked, my dude. I'll be sitting watching TV, also on my phone, watching a TikTok, listening to 8 different people at once. It's a lot, and I'm learning to get better at it and just kind of, pare all that stuff back because it's not good for our brains. But I do think that we do have this mentality of move. Everything needs to move really quick. So I understand that. I do think there is valid criticism though when it comes to Rebirth in particular, and having some sections maybe just feel a little bit too long or padded. Costa del Sol I think is a really good example where your first playthrough, you get there, it's this really cool fun beach environment, there's some fun story stuff happening, but then you are trying to make your way to the beach. But in order to get to the beach, you got to get those dress tickets. And in order to get the dress tickets, you got to play a bunch of mini games. Now, on my first playthrough, I didn't really mind it because, again, I like to use this example. There are things in Rebirth that in other games would be mundane and boring. But because the cast is so well written and colorful and have great chemistry with one another, their interactions just completely override any bad things that I would feel in these segments. So you're spending a lot of time playing these mini games just to get those dress tickets to then just get to the beach. So I could see why people would be like, oh yeah, this is too much. I wish they would just pare back a little bit. On your second playthrough, you can just blaze right through. You don't even have to do any of the dress ticket stuff. You can just go directly to the beach. So I do think there are valid criticisms of moments where they are just a little bit too long, but also our attention spans are just cooked, my dude. Up next, and this one is super exciting, he talks about how they're structuring Remake Part 3. He says, as we work on the conclusion to the trilogy, we are striking a balance on how story arcs are told and spread out so as to ensure that the game feels a bit more concise. I love this. One of my biggest complaints about the Remake trilogy is I really do love the story. I love how everything unfolds. The only problem is, in Remake and Rebirth, it kind of feels like they wait till the last quarter of the game to really hit you with a lot of the big story stuff and how it unfolds. And some of the bigger mysteries going on, and it's like, I just want to know more. Rebirth in particular, I just wanted to know more about Zack, what was going on in all of these different worlds that we see him in. What's going on with Sephiroth, and learning more about Sephiroth, you can turn to Ever Crisis, but you shouldn't have to turn to supplemental material to learn more about a character. Which again, I'm sure they'll take all the important stuff from Ever Crisis that is need to know, and they'll put it in Part 3 because they've been doing that already with this trilogy. You look at Rebirth, and Yuffie talks about the Wutai Revolution that was led by Rufus, and Glenn Lodbrok. But in Ever Crisis, if you want to learn more and get some of the finer details, you can do that. So they've already been doing a really good job of that, I think personally, of just like telling you what you need to know about compilation stuff and how it's now being incorporated. I think they've been doing a good job of that. But to know that for Part 3, they're going to structure out the story stuff better so that way it unfolds better, I think that means that the pacing is going to be better as well. So from beginning to end, I hope to feel that, consistent progression of the story and some of the mysteries that they've been building to hopefully be revealed. So that way it feels like every aspect of the game that I'm playing feels like something is happening, the story's moving along. And again, I think when it comes to structure, I think the first big portion of the game will be really linear to kind of drive the story point forward. And then you'll reach that moment where things open up, maybe when we get the high wind and it's like, okay, now feels like the proper time to just kind of wander around, do side quests before you continue back with the story. So this is really, really awesome and reassuring to hear. Up next, Hamaguchi talks about some of his own personal favorite games. He says, I really enjoy playing video games, and many titles influence my work. I've always enjoyed the Witcher series, as well as the Fable franchise. He also mentions he's playing through Ghost of Yotei, where he says, I can't wait to get home to continue playing it because he's so busy. He just doesn't have time to sit down and play Yotei. Now, on the topic of Yotei, I am currently playing through it. I'm like 20 hours deep. I've only done a handful of story missions, and that's not because the story's not great. It is great. It is intriguing, but my God, the exploration and the side content in this game is incredible. And you're going to hear me say this again in my Game of the Year discussion, but Ghost of Yotei, hands down, has the best world exploration I've ever experienced in a video game, and some of the best side quests. The side quests never feel intrusive, I never feel overwhelmed or obligated to do them. The world is so well constructed that I just can't help but want to do stuff when I come across it and just explore more. The environments are so beautiful. You meet such a colorful cast of people, whether they're supporting characters or just random NPCs. There's all kinds of variety in this stuff, and I'm like, again, 20 plus hours in, and I don't feel bored. I love the exploration stuff. So again, Hamaguchi likes to take some of his own personal games and use them as inspiration for the remake trilogy. So I'm hoping maybe there'll be some Yotei and how that exploration works, maybe creep its way into remake part 3. I think that could be super cool. Again, I think the exploration in part 3 is going to probably be what a lot of us want it to be. Just let us run around and find things for ourselves. We also do have one more tidbit about part 3. This comes to us from Canal Tech from Diego Carumba, but it's being translated by the Shinra Archaeology Department on Twitter. Hamaguchi goes on to say, in part 3, we already start off seeing all the team members together. What they had in mind in terms of storytelling and gameplay is that players would be able to develop a deeper sense of affection for each of these characters, not just Cloud. So the opening hours of part 3 are going to be very, very interesting, especially to see what kind of condition the party is in. Where are they going? We know that Cloud said we need to head north because that's where Sephiroth is, but where do they go first on their destination? Do they go to Rocket Town? Is it Icicle Inn? Where exactly are they going to be heading? But also, the party dynamics. They've just witnessed a very awful, horrible event with the death of Aerith. So that's pretty much going to bond them now for life. And we now officially will have Sid and Vincent in the party. So seeing their group dynamic with all of the other characters, because they've been able to really flesh out characters so much more in this remake trilogy. So seeing more of Vincent's interactions outside of his coffin in Nibelheim. How is he going to react to the world that he sees? What's Sid's reaction going to be like? Because he's now all swept up in this crazy hunt for Sephiroth stuff and the Black Materia and all these crazy things he's now going to be introduced to. But I'm just really, really excited to see and hear the banter between these characters. How do they interact, not just in the main story missions, but on side quests as well. Again, I think Rebirth has done a phenomenal job fleshing out those characters and showing those more fun, intimate moments. So I'm really, really excited to see more of Sid and Vincent, and now that the group is together, how are they all going to operate? What's that party dynamic going to be like? And I'm excited. We all love these characters. We all want to see them grow and do cool stuff together, so that's going to be pretty cool. Up next, we move over to Polygon with an article from Paolo Kawanishi. Up next, Hamaguchi does address some of the people that are just not into the remake trilogy, the naysayers, as Polygon writes. They would go on to write, with 2 games in the trilogy released so far, some fans who played the original aren't happy with the changes. Hamaguchi told me the team is aware of the naysayers, but still excited to see how people will react to the 3rd game. And I think, this is just me personally, I'm not talking crap on anybody, I feel that when part 3 comes out, the people that have been trashing this trilogy for years are probably going to be very curious about how it ends. What do they do? And I think with all of the new gameplay stuff they're going to introduce, it's going to be very appealing. And I think they might pull some of those naysayers in and maybe change their mind. Because you've got so many different camps of people who don't like the game. Again, I completely understand why people wouldn't like the remake trilogy. I get it. But you've got the people that are very constructive and they list why they don't like it. And then you've got some people who are like seemingly just not willing to give it a chance. They're not even allowing themselves to maybe like it because they're so staunch in their beliefs of it has to be how it was in the original, which again, you're entitled to feel how you feel. But I love this trilogy and what they're doing so far. And I just think that when part 3 comes out, it's going to be so appealing in terms of story and gameplay that even the naysayers are going to be like, okay, I kind of want to see what happens and where this goes. Up next, we move over to IGN Brazil with an article from Gabriel Sales. And in this one, Hamaguchi talks about parallel timelines. He says, I can't speak to the content of the 3rd game itself, but these parallel timeline stories have been used extensively in the remake so far. What I can guarantee is that in the 3rd game, we will continue exploring parallel timeline stories, precisely so that we can keep fans curious about how this story will end. Of course, I, as the creator, already know what the outcome of this third part will be, but since the goal is precisely to create this expectation and excitement among fans, we want to play with these narrative possibilities, and only at the end will we know what story we want to tell. And I wanted to bring this one up in particular because about a week or so ago, I won't name the publication, but they posted an interview that I thought had a very misleading headline where it said something to the effect of the ending of Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3 is done, which if you read the interview with Hamaguchi, what he actually said was, I have the conclusion of the third game planned out in my head, which is completely different from, hey, the game is done, they got the ending finished. So I thought that was a little bit misleading. But again, I really love the whole parallel world stuff. I love how they're adding in new stuff that is making us as players go, wait, are they actually really going to change things? And we've talked about this ad nauseum, so I won't spend too much time on it. But obviously there will be the stuff that stays the same, there will be the stuff that's new. I do think the ending will be much like how Subtext mentioned in one of his tweets a while back. The ending of the OG FF7 is probably what we're going to get in this remake trilogy, but it will actually have a much more definitive ending. There won't be any ambiguity there. But I wanted to bring this up too because the talk of parallel worlds. So for the longest time, we were kind of confused on what exactly was going on. Is there one unified live stream that has all of these different worlds in it that are connected via the live stream? So it's not a multiverse situation, which the scenario writer Kazushige Nojima confirmed. This is not a multiverse story. And there's this really brilliant theory video going around within the past week or so by creator John Q Gamer, which does a phenomenal job expanding upon what the game is presenting to us. And that's the wonderful thing about his video. It's not just him theorizing about stuff. He's literally leading you to the points that the game is trying to make. It's a really well-crafted video. I'll leave a link in the description down below, but chances are if you're watching this video, you've probably already seen his video. It's brilliant. But I wanted to pull a section of his video out that I thought was so bang on and interesting, where he talks about this aspect of the remake trilogy of when a character dies, they return to the planet. We hear characters talking about that all the time. And our belief system, and even the character's belief, is that they die, but then they come back to the same planet, essentially reincarnation. So maybe they come back as another person, maybe they come back as flowers, maybe they come back as themselves. But he proposed the idea of what if, when someone dies on the planet, they return to the live stream, but then they repopulate or reincarnate on another planet. And you might be wondering, well, how do we have these other planets? And he broke this down, talking about the Cetra and how they had this battle with Genova. And one of the ways they stopped Genova was by splitting up Genova into multiple parts. But in doing so, they also had to take their world and split it up into multiple parts as well to keep Genova at bay, which is how we would get these multiple worlds that we've been experiencing so far in the remake trilogy. So the idea is, let's say you have Aerith die on our main world and she repopulates on another world. That would explain how we see different versions of Aerith or different versions of Zack, or how Biggs ended up leaving one world and going into another. But then that theory goes even further, and again, this is all stuff that's within the game. He's just presenting it in a way that is so digestible, is that you don't instantly repopulate on another world. It's going to take time. And maybe that's what Sephiroth is doing. His plan is to try and unify all these worlds, creating the Promised Land, bringing back Genova, making her whole. And eventually, I think, this is just me interjecting my own thoughts here, try and rule the planet, you know, a planet where nobody has to die. We've been talking about that since we've been covering Ever Crisis, because it really seems like that's the direction they want to go, where Sephiroth has really struggled his whole life with not being able to make his own choices and decisions and constantly losing people. So what if, you know, his plan is kind of altruistic, but getting there is really messed up? And maybe that's his plan. Create a world where nobody has to die, which is going to be very appealing to someone like Cloud, who just lost Aerith. So maybe that's how Sephiroth kind of strings Cloud into that plan. But the catch is it takes time for someone to repopulate or respawn, if you will, on another planet. And that is maybe what Sephiroth is doing. We see him essentially hunting down these different versions of Aerith to stop her, because if she can't repopulate in time before he unifies the world, then that means he creates a world where Aerith isn't there, the only person who's a Cetra that can stop him. It's this really brilliant theory that he lays out, again, just using the facts that the game is telling us. It's such a brilliant video. My mind feels like it just leveled up 80 levels after watching it. And the idea that Sephiroth would want to do that and entice Cloud by saying, hey, there's a world where no one has to die, Aerith can live forever, while secretly he's hunting down Aerith and ensuring she ain't gonna be on that planet. She ain't gonna be anywhere in this world, I think is incredibly interesting. Again, I'm just kind of, doing a really, really poor explanation of his incredible video and theory, but I highly recommend, if you've got time, go check it out. Again, I'll leave a link in the description. It's a really brilliant video. But I just bring that up because I'm really excited to see, is that the actual direction they're going to go in part 3 with these parallel worlds? Is that the actual explanation of the Cetra splitting up the planet into different planets, thus creating all of these different timelines, if you will? It's just such a really big mystery to unfold in Remake Part 3. And once I think we finish that game, if they can stick the landing and, flesh out the story properly, I think it's going to give us a completely new perspective on not just Remake, but Rebirth in particular. And for the last piece of this article, he talks a little bit more about the gameplay by saying, for everything we do, there are always different challenges, but for this system of the Remake trilogy, we wanted to bring new things to the gameplay. We wanted to surprise the players. So to bring new things and continue to impact people with this game, which, despite being a remake, is also an original game, we needed to be bold in bringing new things. In fact, we don't want to label it turn-based or action game. We just wanted to bring more fun to players with real-time battles, while also trying to maintain some aspects of the turn-based game, and at the same time, allowing the characters to move more freely through the environments during battles. Again, you guys are probably sick of me praising the game's combat system. I honestly don't really know what's left to say about it, but it just kind of, it's the perfect combat system for me. Growing up playing Capcom games and really emphasizing your timing and your movement and spacing, and having that now in a Final Fantasy game, as a kid, that's something even then I wanted. I remember seeing Advent Children and being like, whoa, Cloud and Sephiroth, they're like doing real-time combat and they're flying through the air doing all these crazy cool moves. Eventually we would get something like Dissidia, which brought that style of combat to life, but now we're getting it in the Remake trilogy. I really love the parry system. Timing out your parry is so satisfying. I'm a sucker for a really good parry system. I just think these mechanics blend together so well to give you the best of real-time combat and the best of turn-based stuff. And I do love that this is the mentality they have towards the Remake trilogy's combat system, because I don't think there's any one defining factor of what this combat system actually is. There's action elements with the real-time stuff. There's still turn-based and command-based menu stuff, so it's not really one thing. So not putting a label on it, I think, is a really good idea. And I also think that's just kind of indicative of the mentality Square Enix has in general when it comes to crafting combat systems. Even someone like Yoshi P said recently in an interview that they don't want to essentially box in their developers and force them to do a specific type of combat system. They want that development team to do whatever fits their game and their story and their world best. So if they want to do a take on turn-based that's just turn-based, they'll do that. If they want to do what we got in this combat system with the Remake trilogy, they'll do that too. So there seems to be at least a freedom of expression and experimentation when it comes to approaching a combat system. And I think that not putting a label on it is probably a really good idea, because it's just such an incredibly different and unique combat system that I just truly love. With that being said, that is the end of the video. Let me know in the comments down below what you thought of today's topics, specifically structuring out how the story is going to unfold in part 3, and let me know what you guys think, again, of the game's combat system. I truly love it. I think it's exceptional, special, super refreshing and unique, and it's been, one of my favorite aspects of this trilogy so far. I am Curious Corduroy. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.